looking at this notion, you'll note that I have Ubiquitous Archives as a plural on my slide on the front versus Ubiquitous Archive, but a lot of what we're talking about here is about sort of getting away from some of those simple binaries of the singular archive versus the plural archives, or the inside of the archive and the outside of the archive. And I'm also going to suggest that in terms of this notion of things being present beyond the boundaries of our institutions and in broader society, that there's more ubiquity there's more ubiquitousness there than we might think there is. We may already be in this space, as Deb was suggesting, and this is not necessarily a future. I'm also going to use a very broad conception of the term archive and archives, which may trouble some people in the room. I know that we sometimes have some definitional debates where we're quite keen to patrol the boundaries of the definitions that we use in our profession. I'm going to overstep some of those boundaries and even ignore some of them, which I hope doesn't disturb people too much. But I'm also going to go back to history as a starting point because in terms of the sort of timeframes that we're looking at here, a lot of historians of the archives will trace back these institutions to times like the French Revolution. This is the National Archives in Paris. If we think about that in terms of timescales, that's not very long ago in the grand scheme of things. We're talking a couple of hundred years, a bit over. This is also an institution that's very much located in space as well as in recent time. It's a sort of monolithic building. You need to often go there to find these things. And we know that this has started to change a lot since that point. There's thousands of community archives now. There's digital archives. There's material that's distributed in quite different ways from this sort of very located time and space type institution. But there are also quite different cultural notions of what archives might be that are very different from this sort of conception. Last week I was at the Cultural Collision Symposium at the University of Melbourne, and Gabrielle Nadir was there and was talking about the Warman Arts Centre. And you see this notion in the middle of that corroboree and painting are like our archives. This is a cultural notion of archives that is still in many cases quite bound to the idea of place, but has very different notions of time, and is operating on very different timescales and very different types of time from the sort of time that we experience in Western societies when we're looking at somewhere like the French archives or another large archival institution. It's also very much a case where the preservation of this sort of material and the meaning of this material is about social relationships and cultural relationships. It's about these networks of communication and relationships that exist throughout societies. And that's, if you like, the preservation network rather than it being located in individuals or individual institutions. And I mentioned the term archive. We all know and have possibly complained about the use of the term archive that we see in online sort of environments. You go to your Gmail account and it says, well, do you want to archive this? You go to Twitter and it says, do you want to download your archive? You can go to something like Outlook and archive your email. And we look at all of these things and we think, well, that's not really an archive. That's not what I would call an archive. But it is about maintaining content over periods of time in ways that's a lot more distributed, a lot more separated from notions of place, and to some extent separated from particular notions of time than the ones that we might be used to dealing in other ways. So, I'm curious about the blurring of the boundaries that's starting to happen. These terms are a bit like things like curation, which I know a lot of people in museum and gallery spaces have sort of complained about for a while, that the notion of curation is, people talk about curating their kitchen cupboards or curating a dinner for their friends. There's also notions of the library that have changed a lot. I have an iTunes library, and I don't think that you need to police those boundaries as much, in the sense that my idea of an iTunes library doesn't complicate my understanding of something like what the State Library of Victoria does. It's something that exists in a much more sort of complex space. There's also this idea of online preservation, and I apologise for one of the images on this next slide before it comes up. But we are worried about preservation, but sometimes things get preserved even if they're things that we don't really want to be preserved. This is the kind of unintentional preservation of stuff. And it seems quite sort of simple and flippant to talk about, but this is an instance where there's an interesting dichotomy here, that things that we don't want other people to see in these sorts of instances sometimes are the things where people say, that's going to be there forever. People are always going to be able to find that when they're Googling you or searching for you. When you go for a job interview, this is the stuff that's going to come up. It's this idea, going for the sort of Shakespearean moment, just to raise the tone a little, the Shakespearean moment of the evil that we do lives after us and the good is often interred with our bones, from Julius Caesar. This idea that the things we don't want to be preserved are preserved, whereas the things that we do want to preserve in the digital space, people talk about them as being ephemeral, about them being sort of always on the precipice of disappearing. But the way that these sort of things are preserved is because they become near ubiquitous in their distribution across vast networks of people, across countries, across boundaries. Their preservation and their existence is based on their sort of, in a sense, their virtual ubiquity within the societies in which we live. So I'm not suggesting that these are the only things we want to preserve, but if we think about how we're going to start managing content over different periods of time and across different boundaries, we need to start thinking about this sort of distribution through large-scale social networks in the way that these sort of things operate. I also think, and this sort of follows on probably from some of the comments in this morning's sessions, Joanna Sassoon spoke at the ASA conference in 2007 in Alice Springs, and I'd like to put in a vote for another conference in Alice Springs because I've always wanted to go there. But apart from that, this idea that we spend a lot of time as archivists talking about what we hold and what we do. Again, that's very much sort of reaffirming the boundaries of our institutions. But if we're looking at this in different ways in different spaces, then it's about stepping outside those boundaries and about thinking about how we think as archivists and getting some level of archival thinking distributed throughout communities. And it's working very much outside of those spaces in the co-creation of knowledge. It's working with other people as part of the sort of archival discipline rather than just working as archivists. So I think rather than just the ubiquity of the content that we have potentially, or the ubiquity of our institutions, what we're talking about here is the ubiquity of this sort of archival thinking. How can we get that out into society? And it might be something we can discuss in the discussion session at the end. And just very quickly on users, because there's a flip that's occurred here as well, or certainly a development in the way that this works. Thomas Carlyle, as a historian, the sort of old model of the historian that exists or existed, of someone reading a certain set of material, doing a kind of review of literature, coming up with their version of the truth, coming up with a hypothesis, writing it down in the form of a linear narrative in a book or an article or something of that sort of sort. That in itself is an outmoded notion of what our users might be doing with our content and the way that they might view our sort of work. It's not a user who comes to a particular archive. It's actually Andre Malraux, for those who have an art history background, was doing some of this sort of work since the 1940s about the idea of the museum without walls, the imaginary museum, where if you want to understand art history, for example, you need to actually hold this breadth in your head of the history of art that doesn't exist in any singular museum or any singular sort of institution. It's something which you need to navigate at a much more kind of conceptual, virtual level. So what might an archive without walls look like? What might an imaginary archive look like? And from a user's perspective, those are the sorts of spaces that we're actually traversing when we're looking at dealing with this sort of content. And from the user perspective, William Turkle, Kevin Key and Spencer Roberts wrote in 2013 about the fact that that traditional notion of research is of questionable utility and has been for quite some time. So despite the fact that those sort of modes of history are still being taught in some colleges and university departments, their suggestion is that continuing to teach those sorts of things is acting as if they're preparing students for academic life in the mid-20th century. We also, I think, need to think as archivists whether we're continuing to document our material and deal with our material and deal with our users in a way as if they're still operating in this kind of mode of the old university researcher or the genealogist who's looking for particular content from your particular institution for a particular reason. We need to start sort of exploding some of the boundaries of that. And this is a publicity shot from Apple, but the reason that I put it in there is because this is actually the set of tools that I use when I'm doing a history PhD. We know the sort of effect that digital technologies is having in this space, and that we traverse as researchers these huge boundaries of different sorts of repositories, different sorts of knowledge, and we're doing this in different time frames and in different sort of spatial relationships to our sources than we've done at any point in the past. So though we tend to get buried in the detail of what we do on a sort of day-to-day basis, at some point we need to start stepping back from that and looking at these broader kind of environments that we might exist in. A reef, particularly the Great Barrier Reef, given what's happening at the moment, mightn't be a very good sort of analogy for preservation. But it was around for about 250 million years before that, which is not too bad in the grand scheme of things. And if you go to spaces like this, you can get a sense that you're completely surrounded by this sort of environment, and that there's these complex ecosystems that are operating with different types of users and different users that are both contributing to the construction of these spaces as well as drawing from these spaces. And there are different sorts of visitors to these sort of spaces, whether it be sort of skimming across the top in a glass-bottom boat and just getting a grand perspective on what this area looks like, versus people diving right down and looking at the detail. So how can we work in our archival institutions and archival spaces in ways that supports this sort of diversity for diverse users in a different version of time and space from what we're operating in at the moment? Thank you very much.